I was heading over to Duck Creek Road to look for the old Perky Cemetery and the grave of Jackson Greene, the son of Suki Greene, an incident around whom the feud sort of helped evolve. And I didn't even recognize what I was seeing until I got a closer look. I thought this might have been the Perky Cemetery, but this is actually the cemetery belonging to the Trent Valley Baptist Church. Not a lot of these are left. This is a very unique grave style, sort of reserved for the Melungeons. It's called a house grave. Most of these have rotted away over the years, but this is Reverend David Wolfe, who was born 1817 and died 1886, and his wife, Virginia Jane Wolfe. And this is the Mulberry Gap Baptist Church, sort of in the shadow of Mulberry Ridge. And I'd like to explore some of the graves in this cemetery because I'm positive we'll be able to identify some classic Melungeon names here among the tombstones. Not explicitly Melungeon, but an early settler here related to the Hatfield clan, more well known from their antics in West Virginia. In the back you've got some Gibson graves related to the Gibsons with a P that settled up in Carmel, Ohio. I'm filming a video about the Carmelite Indians pretty soon here. And my main reason for filming today is to actually talk a little bit about the Greene-Jones War and the feud between the two families. There's quite a few Joneses buried in this cemetery too. Another Jones, Grover Cleveland Jones, buried next to his wife, Mary Emmer, in the shadow of the church. And this is a very old Baptist church. You can see some of the remnants of the earliest sort of box graves that these people would make out of local limestone slabs that fell from the cliffs. I've been finding some information on the surnames of Melungeon people. I don't really see Ramsey on many of them, but some people assert that they were Melungeons. And in this cemetery, you've got quite a few Ramseys who lived to adolescence, but not to old age, 1878 to 1897. Floyd Leonard Ramsey died in 1897. He was only 17 years old. Mala sounds like Mahala, which is a very Appalachian name. She died July 30th, 1897. And here is Mel Crockett. Can't get much more mountainous than Crockett Ramsey, July 31st. And all of these Ramseys died from mid-June to late July 1897, probably from disease, but none of them were really all that young. They were young, but they weren't children. The Brewers and Brewsters were both prominent families that a lot of people ascribe to the Melungeon group. We're here where Duck Creek empties out into the Clinch River to talk about the start of the Greene-Jones War. The Greenes were led by Richard Mean Dick Greene, who had a farm right where we're standing. Now, the Greenes would raise hogs, and the Jones boys were lumbermen. They would cut down trees and float them down this river via a fence in Mean Dick's property. In the past, some of Mean Dick's hogs had gotten out and rooted around on the Jones farm because they lived next to each other, and it usually resulted in a few harsh words and nothing more. But today, one of Mean Dick's hogs got out, rooted through the whiskey mash, and destroyed their still. So Asa Jones said, I'm going to take this hog as payment for the moonshine it destroyed. Mean Dick naturally said, very fairly, if your boys had closed the fence, it wouldn't have destroyed your still. So Asa replies, well, because this is my hog and because I'm taking it as payment, you don't have a choice. It's mine to do with what I please. And he shoots it between the eyes right in front of Mean Dick. Now, they don't call Mean Dick for nothing. And this is the moment that, according to most legends, the feud truly became a war. Another version of the story, which seems to be a little bit more realistic, but perhaps a little less fun, is that Mean Dick saw some of his hogs were returning to his property wounded and bloody. So he followed one of his missing hogs to the Jones farm and saw Asa's son, Jim, kicking it and throwing rocks at it. After that, he began beating the boy when Asa ran out with a revolver and said if he didn't unhand his son, then he would shoot Mean Dick Greene. And because they were neighbors, a few days would pass, and sometime in 1888, Jim Jones was going down the road and he passed Mean Dick. Both exchanged some angry words with each other when Greene pulled a revolver and shot at the boy. Now, nobody was killed, But this began the shooting war. Behind this cabin you have Newman's Ridge, the spiritual home of the Melungeon people, and up on top of that ridge was Mahala Mullins, who lived in this cabin. Now eventually the cabin was brought down here and turned into a museum when people began to celebrate the lives of the Melungeons instead of covering them up, because it should be remembered a lot of Melungeons stopped identifying as Melungeon or mixed race and integrated with white families. Now they've mostly either forgotten their heritage or just don't really pay attention, because how many people research this deeply into their own genealogy? Now, the reason Mahala Mullins was so celebrated in this community is because a lot of people who settled here, because they were ostracized by the outside world, had to take jobs bootlegging, moonshining, working as blacksmiths, hard manual labor. You even had some outlaws, and family feuds were very common. Illiteracy was high, and very little information about these feuds was actually recorded because of that. Now, Mullins was called by the sheriff easy to catch but impossible to fetch because she was so heavy. She lived in this cabin up on top of the ridge with her many children, but according to some records she couldn't even be moved out of her door, even though the whiskey still was very obviously right there in the community. And I like to think that the Melungeons more or less put up with this because a lot of that money went right back into Vardy and the Melungeon communities around Newman's Ridge. To our left is Duck Creek, and it's right along this creek that the Greene family had a farm. This specific farm was owned by Jackson Greene and his wife, Suki. The Greene boys all knew they could call their mom like a cow or a pig, and they considered it sort of poking fun at their mom, but she understood that it was all fun and games. However, the Jones boys started calling her like a pig, going, "Here, Suki, Suki," and she would get very, very mad. And from that moment, it became sort of a game between the Jones boys to see how mad they could make Suki Greene, their mother. And you don't insult someone's mother like that back in the 1870s and 80s without facing some serious repercussions. We're here at the Stony Gap Baptist Church to talk a little bit about the lead up to the Greene-Jones War. And it was here in 1887 that a shootout claimed the life of Detective Lander Greene. That day, a revival was taking place, and the detective was in attendance along with most of the community and saw a man who was wanted for shooting a man a year prior. That man's name was William Hobbs. Well, Greene goes and reaches for his revolver to arrest him, but Hobbs shoots the detective dead and quickly flees to Texas. A lot of people, however, began to spread false rumors. Understand, the Greene family, although they were mostly poor pig raisers, they were also folks involved in the law. A lot of them were deputies, and a lot of folks around here seemed to think that they were corrupt, so a lot of people started spreading a false rumor that Detective Greene had shot and killed Hobbs in cold blood, and that he had run off to Texas. Now, Asa Jones, the leader of the Jones faction, firmly believed these rumors, and a lot of the tensions between the two families began to bubble up over the top, and this would sort of precipitate the violence that happened a year later in 1888 after that near shooting on the Clinch River, and then when Mad Dick Greene actually took a couple shots at Jim Jones, Asa's son. And right in front of Stony Gap Baptist Church, where that 1887 shooting took place of Deputy Lander Greene, you've got some of the seals. These are some Melungeon names, and that includes Reverend Willie Seal, who died in 1963. And you can see why they call this place Stony Gap. This is the same over at the ridge that the Melungeons are famous for. Some poor quality land with limestone outcroppings. And in the shadow of Stony Gap Baptist Church, you've got the Greene Minor Cemetery, one of the first large plots I've seen specifically for the Greene family. I'm sitting now next to the grave of Old Asa, the leader of the Jones faction. His real name was William Asa Jones, but he only really went by his middle name, and when I was trying to get a nice overview of the cemetery, because it's on private land, a man flagged me down in his truck and said that he was the man's great something. So it's very fascinating how these families stay in the local area, and to call this the Greene-Jones War would be a little short-sighted because a lot of people felt that the Greene family had sort of sucked up to local law enforcement, and because many of them were involved with the law and were judges or police, they felt that the Greenes were a little bit corrupt. And the folks looked up to Asa Jones as a leader in opposing their power and influence. Jones had lost a brother in the Civil War right before Christmas. Jim Jones was home celebrating, and rebel bushwhackers came and killed him. Now the story here goes that Asa and some of the Greenes were very good friends, but Asa's sons were a little bit rambunctious and started calling one of the Greene wives Suki. Now, her name was Suki, and they would call her Suki among the Greene family because it was sort of like calling a pig. But when the Jones boys did it, they did it maliciously. And they started a fight which would eventually escalate to outright warfare. And who knows how many people died in the Greene-Jones conflict of the 1880s to perhaps even the early 1900s. Hugh Jones, born 1885. I can't make out the name, but this is another Jones boy who fought for the Union Army. John Jones actually fought in the Spanish-American War. A lot of these Joneses are still in the local area. I mean, the man who let me into this cemetery was himself a Jones. Generations of the Jones family have lived along this Clinch Valley Road. You can see their old farms and homes all through. And the man who opened the gates to this cemetery to me was himself a Jones. Many of their kin are buried right here in this cemetery in the shadow of Old Asa, underneath this tree. Throughout 1888, a wave of violence in northeastern Tennessee would wash over the clans. 3 Jones men would ambush 3 Greenes, and although none would die, a Greene man would be shot in the arm so badly he needed to be amputated. The eldest Greene brother of the man who'd been ambushed tried to resolve the fight by walking up to Asa's house in an attitude of surrender. He thought things went well, but as he walked down the driveway, Asa and his boys supposedly began firing from their fortified log cabin. A full-pitched battle would follow, and it seemed like nothing could stop a full-scale conflict. Miraculously, nobody was wounded. The Greenes burned down the Asa home, and his sons were spotted ordering 5 Winchesters from a nearby store. All throughout May, lawmen began to arrest supporters of Asa and then accused them of felonies. This further inflamed tensions because most of the law were Greene supporters. Now, over at the Clinch River, I alluded to the fact that a lot of the details of the Greene-Jones War match up with the Hatfield and McCoy feud. For example, the Hatfields killed a cousin that they felt supported the McCoys at the hog trial. And in the Greene-Jones War, the Greenes tried to kill a young member of their own family, a man named Joel, who sort of started siding with the Joneses because he felt that the Greenes were abusing their power. They shot him, he didn't die, but he had to have his arm amputated, and so a man named Lewis Moore was hired out by the Jones faction to wage a pitched battle. In this battle, he managed to kill an unnamed son of Hamp Greene as well as Dick Greene. Not to be confused with Mean Dick, there were a lot of Dicks in the Greene-Jones War. Following that armed exchange with Lewis Moore, who was sent by the Jones faction, Hamp Greene's home, and remember, Hamp had already lost his son, was surrounded, and in the pitched battle that would follow yet again, over 200 rounds were fired into his home, and his 5-year-old grandson was killed. Keep in mind, the sheriff at that time was a Greene, and he ordered what was described as a literal trainload of guns and ammunition. It was beginning to look very similar to an actual mountain war. At the Stony Fork of Big War Creek is War Creek Baptist Church, which sort of was the gateway for outside parties to enter Sneedville and begin the feud if they were so inclined. A lot of these Appalachian family feuds had support coming in from outsiders or hired guns that the leaders of the clans would invite. And one day in June of 1888, Dr. Clyde Yo came here from a larger city, and his goal was to amputate one of the survivors of the feud. He'd been shot and infection was setting in. However, he sees a body lying on the side of the road, the body of John DeVoe, someone who both sides of the feud seemed to want dead. Naturally, the doctor's primary concern is with helping the people, so he takes this information to the authorities, and both clans, the Joneses and the Greenes, turn against the doctor very fast. In any case, both sides wanted John DeVoe dead. He was related to the Joneses by blood, but had betrayed them to the law, and most Joneses felt that the law was controlled by the Greenes when opportunity fit him. So he was ambushed by both sides of the feud and left for dead. Because Dr. Yo had arrived to amputate one of the Greene boys, the Greenes gave him fair warning: leave this county and never come back. So he left, and eventually was again summoned by the Greenes, who again needed someone amputated, and he arrived, the doctor, with 2 armed men flanking him from either side. It seems like the Greenes and the Joneses put aside their differences for at least that day, because they stood on top of the western ridge and both ambushed him. Both of his armed gunmen that accompanied him as security were killed, and Dr. Yo vanishes to the mists of time. Now, you'll remember the Greene-Jones War really began over here as Duck Creek empties out into the Clinch River, and it ended about 3 miles up the river on Swan Island, now private property, when most of the Greene faction swallowed their pride. Both sides met at Swan Island and agreed to turn in their guns. It seems like almost everybody did this, and thanks to a couple of neutral deputies, some of the Jones faction were apprehended, and all of them gave up without any fuss except for H.F. Farrell, who was taken in without any further fighting. And this pretty much ends the Greene-Jones War. It stopped where it began, on an island on the Clinch River. Farrell was taken to the old jail in Sneedville, which still stands behind the post office, and anybody who was sort of dissenting or trying to reopen old wounds was sent there with him. Just south of the valley that the ambush of Dr. Clyde Yo and John DeVoe took place, if you take War Creek Road west, you would find the ghost town of Luther, Tennessee. And it's here that things began to heat up a little bit after the finale of the feud. See, in October of the following year, once the feud had been concluded, Hamp Greene walked into the post office and gave his nephew a petition to sign. He begged the man, please sign this, it's so the governor can pardon my 2 sons. And the nephew just said, I have no interest and I'm glad the feud is over. So Hamp got very mad at him and claims that his nephew went to go reach for a gun, so Hamp jumped the counter and killed his own nephew. As things began to heat up again, Asa Jones supposedly assassinated the Chief Justice of the county, a man identified only as Barry. The two lived close together, and Asa shot him when he went to his spring house. Realizing this would probably open up all the old wounds of the Greene-Jones feud, he walked to the neighboring county and turned himself in to Sheriff Henry Davis, who's buried right there on the left. And this is the Davis Cemetery, where the sheriff of the neighboring county is buried, where Asa Jones felt that he would face protection, and that was apparently a very neutral move, because you can see buried right next to the sheriff, you've got many Greenes right next to Sheriff Henry Davis. On October 8th, 1942, the Chattanooga Daily Times published a short article titled "Old Feud Disappears as 82-Year-Old Dies." I've come out to the Sandy Springs Missionary Baptist Church where he's buried to tell you a little of the story and to finally wrap up the feud, which sort of ended as quickly as it began. Decades before the last feudist died in 1942, lawmen traveled to Texas in 1893 to arrest the last fugitive who remained on the run. That man's name was William Hobbs, and he had shot a lawman named Greene and killed him way back during the warring years. However, when he got back to Sneedville, he only served a few years in jail, and then around came 1900 and the events of Mad Dick Greene, whose farm the feud began on. He got into a fight with his wife and shot her, and then he shot his daughter. Both survived, but thinking he'd killed them, he then shot himself. There is no known grave for Mad Dick in the county, and he's probably buried in an unmarked cemetery somewhere. And the Greene Harris Cemetery is about 1 mile up this road along Newman's Ridge, where we'll find the grave of Lank Greene. I hope it's not on private property, but if it is, I'll tell his story anyway, and throw in a photo from Find a Grave. By the way, this is the Greene Harris Cemetery, but it's signposted just up the road from the church as the Johnson Cemetery. So this is where the GPS led me for the Greene Harris Cemetery, although it seems like pretty much everybody here is the Johnson or Seal clans, but either way, I want to read the story of the last feudist who died in 1942. The newspaper said, "Death has silenced the last participant of the publicized Greene-Jones feud 40 years ago. Lincoln Greene, an 82-year-old mountain man who once shouldered an accurate rifle in the East Tennessee hills, died yesterday at the home of a daughter to write the last chapter of the feud. Residents have forgotten the cause of the long-standing trouble between the Greenes and Joneses, but it lasted many years with various strife. Greene's last brush with the law was 3 years ago, when he was sentenced to a year in prison upon conviction of shooting his son-in-law." And like I said, there's many Johnsons buried here. The N is backwards. You can kind of tell a lot of these folks were illiterate and sort of just looking off of dates that were available to them. And here's a small section of the Seals. Isaac M. Seal, who died just before Christmas, 1926, and Johnny Seal. And once you cross over the Mulberry Gap, this is the valley, the end of which, about 4 miles down this road, you get to Mahala Mullins' cabin, which is a fascinating, fascinating place. She's worthy of a video all her own. I'll just describe it shortly here. But this is the spiritual nexus of where the triracial isolate people in eastern Tennessee lived and died. Right down there, peeking up over the road, is the cabin of Mahala Mullins, sort of the most famous Melungeon. But before I show you that, I want to show you the Vardy Community Cemetery. This was established in 1870, probably had burials before then, but I'd like to talk a little bit about a short feud in the 1920s with the Collins family. And you can already see the names of the Gibsons all around here. Melungeons, Collins in the back. Another Melungeon family. Another short and explosive feud began in May of 1920 when Bedford Anderson was shot and killed in front of the home of Ardell Collins. And buried here is 18-year-old Charlie Collins, Ardell's son. See, he wanted to see a man named Price, believed to be from Athens, Tennessee, who he thought was in the Collins' home. Apparently, Ardell reported that Bedford Anderson was arguing with Price when a shot rang out. Ardell ran to see what was the matter and only saw the lifeless body of his friend Anderson. Everyone involved with this feud was very closely related, and the talk of the town was that Price and Anderson were arguing over a woman, as was often the case with these mountain conflicts. When Ardell tried to stop the feud, Anderson pulled out a pistol and was immediately blown away by Ardell's son, Charlie. He'd killed his own uncle, and now he had 7 angry cousins hanging out around the family property. The following day, young Charlie Collins was arrested, but he told the sheriff he felt Bedford Anderson intended to kill his father. Whatever happened to this Price fellow from Athens is a mystery and might actually have just been invented by the family to throw police off the trail. Now, the way these feuds usually went with mountain folk from before the Civil War all the way up until past the Great Depression is that a man would kill another or shoot another be let off the hook for reason of self-defense, and then both families would fight it out until they were tired, demoralized, or moved out of the area, and that seems to be the case with young Charlie here. He was quickly let go, and on his 18th birthday was shot and killed by Lee Rhea. At that time, the Rhea and Marion families were in a feud, but Charlie and his dad Ardill didn't know this, and went over to Charlie's brother-in-law, George Marion, when the Rhea family opened fire. Ardill was shot in the face but lived. However, the incident wrapped up the Collins family in the whole mess. Ardill, Charlie's father, was brought captive to the woods, and a raiding party was sent back to the Marion house. When they saw little Charlie standing there, he was shot in the face, maybe unintentionally. Now, the way the Collins family tells this story is that he was just an innocent bystander. However, it seems to be the case that the prior murder in 1921 seems to have gotten a little bit of attention thrown on the Collins family, and Charlie was killed as a result. Now, the Collins family is still going strong in northeastern Tennessee today, but after burying their 18-year-old son, his father and mother, Ardill and Sari, moved to Indiana. And as we pan around, in the back of the cemetery, you've got more recent Collins burials. Over here are the graves of some of the young children born at birth. Elizabeth Collins, born all the way back in 1830, died in 1916. And over here, I think, is a very interesting Collins grave. Theodore Roosevelt McKinley Collins. Now, a lot of the Melungeons have surnames that are pretty commonplace, Davis and Collins, but then you'll see some names that are just interesting. I haven't really seen a Tivis before. It must be remembered that East Tennessee was one of the most pro-Union places in the Confederacy, and a lot of these folks actually served for the Union Army. Buried here is McKinley Collins, who fought in Company E in the East Tennessee Cavalry, and buried behind him is Charlie Collins, the story we just talked about. More Jones graves in the Vardy Cemetery. Jenny O. Jones died fairly young, only 37. And more deaths at young ages. Earl James died a young man, 1966. And even more Collins men who served in the Union Army. And this is Jasper Mullins, who served in Korea in World War II. I wonder if he's related to Mahala Mullins. Estimates made in the 1950s suggest there could have been as many as 200,000 Melungeons, but they don't really use that as an identifying term anymore, because for a very long period of time, the Melungeon people were targeted by Jim Crow laws. That's why a lot of their origin stories that they apply to themselves insist that they are the descendants of Portuguese shipwrecked sailors or Spanish men who defected from De Soto's 1540 expedition, and the Melungeon, during their own lore, they sort of omitted any of their black history because to have a drop of black blood made you a second-class citizen for so much of American history. Nowadays, this is a private home, but back in the day, it was owned by Reverend Chester Leonard, who really took the leadership into his own hands and led the community, preserved a lot of their history, and helped to make movies, sort of highlighting the way they lived their lives. He actually made a very positive impact on this community, according to the sources I've read. And you can see Preacher Leonard, as they called him, actually ordered this house from a Sears Roebuck catalog. The church itself was built in 1898 and dedicated in 1899. It now serves as a museum for the Melungeon community, and the Rankin Cottage to its left was the home of the missionary Mary J. Rankin, a Scotswoman who came to Vardy in 1910 and spent over 3 decades here. And that is the home right over there. And to this day, Mahala Mullins is buried somewhere in the forests, atop Newman's Ridge, way up there in the hills. And this is the Gallahan Cemetery at the entrance of the valley, just as you come up over the ridge and make your way over to the Mahala Mullins cabin and the Vardy Museum.